Chapter 5. A Murder on Eliza Street. In the summer of 1881, a William Murray from East Belfast died in hospital as a consequence of alcohol abuse. The countdown to Murray's death began in his home on Eliza Street, where he lived with his wife Jane, their son and their daughter. Murray also worked in East Belfast in an area called Ballymacarrat at a plant McLeish's which made vitriol. William Murray enjoyed a flutter on the horses, which he proved one afternoon in July when he had the day off work. East Belfast's population was predominantly Protestant, and so many businesses in that quarter of the city gave extended holidays in the middle of July to allow for their workers to attend the annual celebrations for the anniversary of King William III's arrival in the north of Ireland in the 1690s. The aspiring king had arrived with an army that won several subsequent major military victories that were regarded by many Irish Protestants as a significant part of their heritage. King William's landing and the anniversary of his major triumphs, mainly the relief of Derry and the battles of Aughrim and the Boyne, were typically commemorated with marches and bonfires. William Murray took his horse and cart out of Belfast to horse races being held at an area called the Maze. After the races ended, two of Murray's neighbours headed back to East Belfast where they saw William's wife Jane and gave her a heads up that the last they'd seen of her husband, he was pretty deep in his cups. William Murray's drinking wasn't a secret, and it was a problem, which was why the two lads warned Jane. Back at the pub that he'd stopped at en route from the races, Murray started chatting with a punter called Daniel Ward. They started drinking together, sinking pints, discussing the day's races, and running out of money. Daniel Ward called it quits, but Murray didn't feel like doing the same. So he hauled himself back up into his cart and made for his home on Eliza Street, where he ordered his wife to give him her day's wages so he could go back to the pub. Like many working-class families in the Victorian era, the Murrays could not feasibly survive as a single-income household, and so Jane Murray ran the local animal feed store where she did quite well. William wanted that day's takings to take with him to the pub. It came out later that William Murray had often beaten his wife in the past. In the euphemistic turn of phrase in that part of the city, he wasn't good to her. A saying, the meaning of which everybody in East Belfast understood when they heard it. So rather than protest when William demanded her money to take himself to the pub, Jane went and immediately got him the 7 shillings she had made that day in her shop. Convinced that Jane must have made more than that and that she was holding out on him, William began screaming at her to give him the rest of the money. He refused to believe his wife's insistence that she was telling the truth, and he struck her just as their teenage son, William Murray Jr., ran into the room, hearing his mother's screams. Younger William told his father to leave Jane alone and to believe her 7 shillings was the profit made by the animal feed store that day. Enraged by his son's defiance, Murray Sr. smacked him as a terrified Jane ran out of the house at her son's urging. Jane's daughter went after her mother, while Murray Sr. continued his argument with his son that moved into the kitchen. The Murray ladies outside on Eliza Street were joined by one of their neighbours, Mrs. O'Neill, who came out of her house when she saw that Jane Murray was bleeding. From outside, the 3 women could hear the father and son's row continuing in the house. Accounts differ as to what happened next, but Murray Sr. claimed his son lifted up a broom and smacked him with it, causing him to fall. His son insisted that his father had been so drunk that he'd fallen over and hit his head off the kitchen's metal fender. Murray Sr. was screaming in rage and pain for somebody to help, but his wife, paralysed with fear on the street outside, couldn't bring herself to go back inside the house. Murray Jr. was in shock himself at what had happened to his father, and it wasn't until his sister worked up the courage to go back inside that she saw their father bleeding on the kitchen floor, his voice growing less wrathful, quieter, more fearful. The family, with Mrs. O'Neill's help, decided to contact a doctor who arranged for William Murray to be brought from home to the local hospital. An examination there established that Murray had a severe head wound and also a previously undiagnosed knee injury. Police arrived at the hospital from the Royal Irish Constabulary, Ireland's police force, from 1822 until it was disbanded by division in 1922 to be split into the Royal Ulster Constabulary for the north and An Garda Síochána for the south. Ill but vengeful, Murray told the officers that he was in hospital because his son had struck him violently with a broom. This was corroborated, potentially reluctantly, by a doctor who examined Mr. Murray and concluded that the wounds on his head could not have been caused by him falling and hitting his head on a fender. They were caused by blunt force trauma, likely, though not definitely, by something like a heavily swung kitchen broom. A day later, Murray Sr. asked the police to come back to the hospital where he retracted his statement. He explained he'd been very drunk and that he couldn't remember whether he'd fallen or been hit by his son. The day after that, William Murray died in hospital and the police arrested his teenage son for his murder. As far as they were concerned, the late Mr. Murray had been trying to protect his son with that deathbed retraction. Whether or not Murray Sr. could remember what had happened, the police had the doctor's testimony that it was not credible that Murray's head wound had been caused by a fall. He had been hit with something. And whatever that something had been, a broom, the item specified in Mr. Murray's first statement, was certainly a credible possibility. The reason why I suspect the medical examiner was only imparting this information reluctantly was because he tried to add in the caveat that he couldn't be absolutely certain that the head wound had killed Murray, as he may have been ultimately killed by the infection in his knee. At her son's trial, Jane Murray testified about the abuse she had suffered from her husband, and specifically the violent drunken attack of that fateful day. After being sworn in under the Bible, her daughter confirmed that yes, her father had told her that he'd been hit by her brother, but she hadn't personally seen William Jr. do it. William Jr., for his part, continued to deny that he'd struck his father, even in self-defence. The police, too, may have started to feel reluctance at prosecuting the case against the teenager as more and more evidence came to light in the courtroom about what an appalling husband and father the late Mr. Murray had been. Although many in the police clearly believed that younger William was committing perjury because they felt all the evidence pointed to him having struck his father with the broom that then sent the older William hurtling to the floor, the consensus seemed to be that the poor young man had swung the broom in panicked self-defence, and why should somebody else suffer in a family that had already suffered so much? So the police had the coroner tell the jury that the Royal Irish Constabulary would be content with an open verdict because the facts were unclear. Nobody could say for certain what had caused William Murray's death. Was it his knee? Was it a fall? Was it an attack? Nobody knew, nor, the coroner led the jury, were they ever likely to know. The jury apparently didn't need much persuading either. An open verdict was quickly returned, allowing the young William to leave as a free man with his mother and sister to return to their much quieter, safer home on Eliza Street.